Hello, and welcome to the Office of the State Historian's Tertulia Histórica. This is a lecture series sponsored by the Office of the State Historian of New Mexico. I'm Robert Martinez, and today I want to talk to you about the Mulattos of Cochiti, Caste in Spanish New Mexico. Not to be born of an honorable father would be a blemish, I must own. If receiving my being from no other, I had not known it was his alone. Far more generous was your mother, when she arranged your ancestry, offering many a likely father, among whom to choose your pedigree. Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz. She was a famous nun and poet in New Spain in the 1600s, and she was speaking about her own illegitimate, out-of-wedlock birth. And it talks a lot about ancestry, pedigree, and heritage. And that's what the Casta system in New Spain, now Mexico, addresses. Here's another quote. In New Mexico, there are no castas of African origin. My province is probably the only one with this prerogative in all of Spanish America. At no time has any casta of people of African origin been known there. Spaniards and pure Indians, that are hardly distinguishable from ourselves, are the ones who make up the total of 40,000 inhabitants. This was Pedro Pino in 1812 at the Spanish Cortes in Cadiz, Spain, reporting to the King of Spain about New Mexico. He meant well, but he didn't really know his ancestry or that of New Mexicans. There were Africans in New Mexico in the Spanish colonial days, and they are in the ancestry of New Mexicans. Also, this quote that Spaniards and pure Indians that are hardly distinguishable from ourselves tells us something about the local population, looking the same, dressing the same, living the same. Here's a periodization of New Mexico history referencing the Spanish colonial period. In 1519, Hernán Cortés conquered Tenochtitlan, the city of Aztecs. By 1535, we have a viceroy or virrey, a vice king, in Mexico City, Antonio de Mendoza. And our Spanish colonial period in New Mexico is 1598 to 1821, except for that brief period from 1680 with the Pueblo Revolt up to 1692 when the Spanish returned. From 1821 to 1848, we're Mexicans. And then 1850 to 1912, we become a territory of the United States. And finally, 1912, statehood for New Mexico. Look at this map of the Camino Real. This shows the royal road that extended from Mexico City in the south all the way through cities and towns like Querétaro, Guanajuato, Aguascalientes, Zacatecas, and Durango, northward to Parral in Chihuahua, then Paso del Norte, today Juarez, and of course Albuquerque and Santa Fe. This road brought people, goods, ideas, and of course different races of people that mixed in all of these communities. The 1500s in Nueva España, or New Spain, that is now Mexico. In the 1500s, after the conquest, you had two communities, the República Española, the Spanish Republic, and the República India, the Indian Republic. This was a simple way of separating Spaniards and Indians. And there were very few Spanish people compared to Native Americans. Initially, the offspring of a Spaniard and an Indian was considered Español or Spanish, but that changed as the mixed blood population started to overwhelm both Spanish and Indian communities. The 1600s in New Spain. Things start to change as Africans were brought in to New Spain both as slaves and freemen. They were brought in to do heavy lifting, the hard work. Indians were exempt from slavery. Initially they weren't, but eventually they are left out of this system. So Africans are brought in to be part of the colonial system. At first there were striking contrasts between Indians and blacks, Spanish and Indians, and blacks and Spanish. But things start to get a little bit complex when interracial mixing took place, and it took place a lot. Spanish officials and church officials had to contend with this, and they had to answer the question, What do you do about these people that do not fit nicely into black and white definitions? The 1700s in Nueva España. The Spanish colonial society by the 1700s was racially and ethnically complex. This was the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, so it became very popular to categorize everything. Categorize animals, plants, so why not classify people? This became a race-obsessed society. So what is caste? Caste in Spanish is casta, and it's a system of dividing society into racial and ethnic categories. This was very strict in places like Mexico City and Puebla, but it was more fluid in outlying areas like New Mexico. Church records are an excellent place to see these casta designations being used and sometimes misused. This all comes about as a result of the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563. It wasn't an every year event. It took place about every 10 years. Obviously, it addressed the Protestant Reformation, but also it looked at things like sacraments needing to be recorded because people, starting in 1492, started to move far away, and it needed to be written down that they had been administered sacraments. So in New Spain, in Mexico, you start to see in 1585 records of baptisms, marriage information, marriages, burials. They were separated based on Spanish people, Indian people, and casta, meaning mixed blood people. 1603, you get your first casta register in the Sagrario Cathedral in Mexico City. This creates a lot of extra work and confusion for priests. There's ambiguity, confusion, and even indifference depending on whoever's recording casta designations in records. The mestizo application is very inconsistent. Sometimes it shows up in casta books, sometimes in Espanol books, and sometimes in Indian books. By the 1800s, the crown insisted that priests have to record casta calidad, or quality. Bishop ordered that priests must register that they had administered the sacrament. That was what was most important, but the rest was not that important, and that whatever they were told about a person, about their caste designation, or their own perception, was okay, but it could be arbitrary. Inquisition Catalogue title page. This is a Inquisition page from the National Archives in Mexico City, and it says, Memoria de los Sanbenitos que pusieron en la Iglesia Catedral de esta Ciudad de México el año de 1667. It's just a list of Sanbenitos accusations that were placed in the Cathedral Church of Mexico City in 1667. We'll see what some of these were. Inquisition documents. This is a page from that catalog. It's a partial list, and it shows the different things people were accused of. Mostly people were accused of judaizante, or being a secret Jew while outwardly Catholic. Also luterano, a catch-all phrase for Protestant. And tratos notables con el demonio, trafficking with the devil. It was an international list. You'll find people from Spain, from Mexico, Portugal, from France, England, Africans, a lot of mulattos, half African and half Spanish, people accused of witchcraft and other illegal activity. Calidad versus status. Calidad de casta was often secondary to one's station in life. This just meant the quality of your caste, and it didn't just have to do with race, it had to do with your place in society. What often mattered most was your wealth or lack of wealth, occupation, whether it was a high-level job or a lower-level job, how one dressed, and how one carried themselves. Skin color also mattered, but could be secondary. The casta system in Spanish colonial Mexico. Look at this list. Obviously, there's a lot of different intermixing going on in Spanish colonial society in what's now Mexico and New Mexico. At the top, a Spaniard and an Indian would produce a mestizo, a Spaniard and a mestizo, a castiza, and there you go, a castiza and an español would produce an español. This is how you moved up in the casta system. And as you go down, you see mestindio, it sounds like Mustang, or you see coyote or lobo. These are animal designations to describe humans, very insulting. And there was also a way of showing how it was not looked nicely on if you were mixing races, especially at the lower rings of the ladder. At the bottom, you have the barcino y de mulata torna atrás, a throwback when a baby is obviously so mixed, you don't know if they come out white or black. Again, racist and even racial obsession in the colonial society. Genízaros, this is a local New Mexican phenomenon, the 1700s. I have them in this presentation. They were not part of the typical casta system, but in New Mexico they are part of the social and ethnic fabric. In the early 1700s, the term was used by Diego de Vargas to describe some Native Americans, and it means janissary or auxiliary. The Ottoman Turks would take Christian children, boys, and raise them to be soldiers, and they would go first into battle and be a buffer between the enemy and the Ottoman Turks. In New Spain, the term Ladino was used for Hispanicized Indian, or one who spoke Spanish, a Hispanicized native person. Ladino in Spain was the language of the Sephardic Jews, but it's not the same in the Americas. In New Mexico, Genízaros were non-Pueblo Native Americans who were cautivos, or captured by other nomadic Indian groups and put in captivity in Hispano households. Some Pueblo people could be Genízaros, Hopi as well, Comanche, Apache, Navajo, Ute, Pawnee. It depended on the native group that was being raided. And the Spanish would also raid these communities and bring women and children to be put into Hispanic households as servants, or more truthfully, as slaves, as they were compelled to do this. They weren't given a choice. They were catechized, baptized, and given Christian names, and they were marginalized, no longer belonging to their tribe of origin, and yet not totally accepted into Hispano society. So they were part of the society, but they were not part of the society. In 1733, the first attempt to have a Genízaro community was at Sandia Pueblo. In that area, they had applied for a land grant and were turned down. In the 1750 census record, we find them recorded at Taos, Rio Arriba, and Belén, and later at San Miguel del Vado. They're in these communities, but they're also separated out. They're not a part of the community. There's a list of the Hispanic families, and then it'll say Genízaros and list those families that were Genízaro. Eventually, they also become part of the Hispanic population through intermarriage, but they also, again, have their own communities eventually, and we'll see how and why. This is Abiquiu, a photo, one of the earliest photos there exists of Abiquiu, probably from the late 1800s. Abiquiu originally was a Hispano settlement in the late 1740s. It was abandoned in 1747 because it was a very dangerous place to live. There were Indian attacks from nomadic tribes, and the people eventually left and went back to places like Santa Cruz de la Cañada. Governor Tomás Vélez Cachupin resettled the area in the mid-1750s with Genízaros, but also Hispanos were settled just downriver at Santa Rosa de Lima, and these folks were interacting in the marketplace and in other ways. So Abiquiu is an important center of Genízaro living and culture. Let's look at this marriage at Sandia Pueblo. It's dated 12 December 1782. This is one of my ancestors. Josef Antonio Jaramillo is listed as Spanish, and he married Juana Montoya Mestiza. This shows Hispanics marrying people who are part Hispanic and part Native American. So we have this in a lot of records in New Mexico. It's happening everywhere. The casta system is in play in the 1700s in New Mexico. Here's a baptismal record for another ancestor, Julian Ramon Salas, listed as mulatto, vecino, resident. It's from La Cañada de Cochiti, a Hispanic settlement in the 1700s adjacent to Cochiti Pueblo. It was abandoned later on, but this is from 21 March 1777. And the priest at this time, Fray Estanislado Mariano de Marulanda, he starts to record the people as being mulatto or the Calidad mulatto. And these people at first, before, were listed as Espanol, and later on will be Espanol. But this shows a lot about attitudes that people from the outside had of the local population. They looked down on the people. Here's a burial record for Julian Ramon's father, Alonso Salas. This is later on, 1781, and he's listed as an Espanol. So from being the Calidad mulatto, he is listed as Espanol. This shows the fluidity of the Casta designations in New Mexico. Here's Julian Ramon much later. He's getting married to Dionisia de Jesus Padilla, and he's listed in this record as Espanol. So he was baptized as a mulatto and married as an Espanol. Let's look at this priest as an example, Fray Estanislado Mariano Marulanda. His full name was Estanislado Mariano de Marulanda y Ramirez. He was born in Ozumba, Mexico around 1734. His parents were Jose Antonio Marulanda and Estefania Ramirez. That Ramirez family is important because it connects him to his first cousin, a renowned priest, scientist, historian, and writer, Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez. The reason this is important is it connects this family to the upper classes in Mexico, in colonial Mexico. Here's an image of Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez. I have it because I'd like to think it tells us a little bit of what our priest, Estanislado, might have looked like. Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz, the famous nun, her full name was Juana Ines de Azbaje y Ramirez de Santiana. And that Ramirez name right there connects her to the priest through that Ramirez line. And again, she was from the upper classes, so were they. And that's important because they were criollos, Spaniards born in the New World. So why does this matter? Why does their pedigree matter? They were criollos, Spanish born in the Americas. These folks held economic power, they held church power along with peninsulares, who were Spanish priests from Spain, but they held little or no political power, they held little or no military power, and they lorded what power they did have over local mestizos and mulattos. So what is calidad? This just means quality or status. What would determine your calidad? Well, skin color would have something to do with it, occupation, wealth, perceived purity of blood, honor, integrity, and place of origin. Legitimacy was important. If you were born out of wedlock, this could affect your calidad. Calidad was determined not only by skin color, but also social and moral attributes. So now we're going to look at casta paintings. These are important. These are paintings commissioned to illustrate the variety of intermixing taking place in the colonies of the Indies in the 1600s and 1700s. They were also commissioned to show the king and queen what their subjects looked like in the Americas, the different racial mixtures going on. And they could be used as propaganda to serve as a warning as to what bad things could happen if the races mixed. So let's look at this concept of whitening or washing. This was one way to maneuver the casta system. An Espanol and an Indian would then have a mestizo who that person would then get together with an Española, and they would have a castiza who was mostly Spanish, and then have a child with an Español, and that child would then be Español. There you go. That's why so many people in the 1700s are designated as Español. It did not mean from Spain, it just meant they were essentially of Spanish ancestry, but they also did have Native American ancestry. Look at this image. De Negro y de India sale Lobo. This was obviously a propaganda image that warned about mixing blacks and Indians. It looks like a violent union. The child is caught in the middle, not having a good time, and So this was one of the Casta paintings that showed the bad things that supposedly could happen with race mixing. Again, very race obsessed, and anxiety for the ruling Spaniards. De Español y Negra, mulatto. From a Spaniard and an African, a mulatto. This is a little calmer. There's a Spanish man with an African woman with their child. A very peaceful domestic scene. Here's a different version. Mulata, offspring of Spanish and African woman. She's obviously angry. She looks like she's going to hit her Spanish husband. He's fending her off, and the child is crying and caught in the middle. This is not a very pleasant scene at home. De Español y mulata produce morisca. From a Spaniard and a mulata, you get a morisca. In Spain, a morisca was a Moor, a Muslim, or part Muslim. But in the New World, it means that you're mainly Spanish, but you have about a quarter African. There's a morisca painting that shows a little bit less happy scene at home. She's obviously angry, wondering maybe where he's been, and he's saying, don't yell so loud, the neighbors will hear, and the child's obviously going to help mom. De Español y de India produce mestizo. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. That is very common in New Mexico and all over the Spanish world, meaning part Spanish and part Native American. You could tell the children are different shades of skin to show the racial mixing. And the clothes, too, tell us something. You were supposed to dress a certain way depending on your casta designation. De mestizo de India sale coyote. Coyote obviously is an animal, not a very nice term. It just means from a mestizo and an Indian you get coyote. In New Mexico, coyote was somebody who was likely to have at least one Pueblo Indian parent and another probably mestizo parent. And this means a person who's mainly Indian, maybe a quarter Spanish. De Español y mestiza castiza. From a Spaniard and a mestiza woman, you get a castiza child. So it means she's almost Spanish, not quite, but almost. And there you go. From castizo and española produce española. You have from a Spaniard and a castizo person, you get an española, a Spanish child. This family has moved up in the casta system over about 2 or 3 generations. So there's castas, paintings that help to organize society and also help people maneuver through society. So what do we learn from these casta images? They're static. They tell us, obviously, racial blending was going on in New Spain and New Mexico. They tell us certain cultural attributes that were expected of the different people who lived this life and were members of certain casta groups. And again, they tell us some things, but not everything. They don't tell us how hard life might have been or the struggles they might have had. And some were warnings about mixing races. Africans and mulattoes in New Mexico. New Mexico's African history is deep, and it goes back many centuries. It starts in 1539, when Esteban the Moor, or Estevanico, he comes as an explorer with Fray Marcos de Niza, and he, Esteban the Moor, the African, he's the first official Spanish representative to the Pueblos at Zuni. With colonization in 1598, we get various colonists coming here. Alvaro Garcia Delgado was listed as a mulatto. Cristobal López de Áviles from Oviedo, Spain, was also listed as mulatto. So there was a racial mixing going on in Spain. He was described as swarthy and black-bearded. I mentioned in 1598 a colonist, Bartolomé Romero. He established the Romero family of New Mexico. All of us have him as an ancestor. He was from Corral de Almaguer, and he was also described as dark and black-bearded. So I wondered, was he also a mulatto? I don't know, but it's intriguing. He was a colonist in New Mexico. Africans and mulattoes. Black slaves were part of the 1598 expedition. Some escaped, never to come to New Mexico. The reconquest of New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt by Diego de Vargas in 1692. He brought an African drummer and town crier from the Congo named Sebastián de Rodriguez. He established a family in New Mexico, and his grandchildren helped establish Las Trampas. Towns like Las Trampas and Truchas Governor Velez Cachupin in the 1750s, he would get Genízaros, mixed blood Casta people from places like Taos and Santa Fe and Santa Cruz, and he would establish these communities on the periphery as buffers, again, Janissaries, Genízaros, buffers between, on the one hand, Pueblo and Spanish communities, and then on the other, raiding nomadic Native American warrior people like the Comanches and the Apaches. So what were some of the priests saying about New Mexico people in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s? Fray Esteban de Perea in 1631 said, "Inhabitants of New Mexico are made up of so many mestizos, mulattoes, and others who are worse, so dangerous and of little moral strength." He was sometimes embarrassed by the people of New Mexico and felt that the local Native American people, the Pueblos, had a bad influence. Well, clearly he had a superiority complex and looked down on the local people. But he was also saying something about the type of people, the casta type that they were, that he perceived them to be. And it didn't just have to do with race, it had to do with how they lived their lives, and they were some of them were probably very poor. Fray Alonso de Posada, 1661. New Mexico has no more than 100 citizens or vecinos. They're mulattoes, mestizos, and all have Spanish blood, though it is slight. He's acknowledging a truth there. New Mexicans have Spanish blood. They have roots in Spain, but they have other roots too, he's saying, African and Native American. Fray Atanasio Dominguez, 1776. This priest came to explore the Great Basin along with Fray Silvestre Velez Escalante, but also to take an inventory of all of our churches and our people. And he came from the big city, Mexico City, and he came to what he considered the sticks, New Mexico. And he looked down on the people here and on our culture, and he said about the people of Santa Cruz, suffice to say that most of them pass for Spaniards. That's an interesting term. It means that they could pass, they might look Spanish, but he also said there's something different about them. About the people of Las Trampas, for the most part, they are a ragged lot. They are as festive as they are poor and very merry. They are low class, and there are very few of good or even moderately good blood. Well, clearly he looked down on the people of Las Trampas. I have roots there on my dad's side, and they were very happy. I'm glad, but he obviously did not think them to be very Spanish. Fray Ambrosio Guerra, 1801, about the people of Albuquerque. All our vecinos or residents, most are Genízaros, which is a mixture of various nations, and the rest are mulattos, coyotes, and a few Spanish, although most consider themselves Spanish without it being so. And then he went on to say that they speak no other language other than poorly understood Castilian. So already, Fray Atanasio Dominguez said something similar about the Genízaros twisting around the Spanish language and not understanding it, and that the Hispanic people could speak a Castilian language of their own making or own creation. In other words, they already thought we spoke Spanish funny or different, which we did. It was a mixture of our history, Spanish, native Mexican, and native New Mexican. Passing for Spanish, they pass for Spaniards. Many pass for Spaniards who in their own hearts know they are mulattoes. Well, 1774, some people think that these people, these priests and government officials were just being insulting, and there was probably some of that going on. But passing as a Spaniard was a serious threat to the maintenance and alignment of the social order, which required constant management and surveillance. Because the ruling classes, first of all, Spaniards from Spain, and then criollos, Spaniards born in Mexico, they did not want their place at the top usurped by mestizos, mulattos, coyotes, indios, Africans. They did not want that to happen. So you were not allowed to try to pass for Spanish. But it happened, and there are many cases dealing with that. So let's look at this term Español. It just means Spaniard or Spanish. Is the term useless? In some ways it is, only because in New Mexico, it really is a catch-all term that just means you lived a certain way. It didn't mean you were from Spain or all of your ancestors were from Spain. It mattered in some contexts, and in others it didn't. In New Mexico, it did not mean from Spain or of only Spanish ancestry. As we saw, you could be considered Español and have Native American ancestry. The Spanish were very forgiving of Native ancestry, not so much about African ancestry. It meant culturally you lived a Spanish life, more or less, and that you maybe even looked Spanish, more or less, and lived an ethnically Spanish life. So let's look at New Mexico Castas, because New Mexico had a strong Casta population. The Martinez family. This family was established by Hernán Martín Serrano, a Spaniard, and he came in 1598 with the Oñate expedition. Out of the gate, he had 2 sons with native women. His son Hernán II was the son of Ines, an acculturated Tano Indian woman who was treated like a Spanish woman. She could speak Spanish and even was given the designation of Doña, that is a term usually reserved for Spanish women. Luis, his second son, possibly was the son of Ines or of another native woman. We know this because there was an Inquisition case for Governor Bernardo López de Mendizábal in the mid-1600s, and in the back and forth accusations in these documents, the governor called Hernán Martín a mestizo and a buffoon. Obviously, that is insulting. So Hernán was also an encomendero. So his mestizo background didn't keep him from being at the top of New Mexico Spanish colonial society. An encomendero collected tribute from Pueblo people. His brother Luis was also called mestizo and even indio in the same document. This was possibly based on his appearance or what the community said about Luis and Hernán. Another family that was Casta was the Montoya family. The founder of the Montoya family in New Mexico, Bartolomé de Montoya, was from Cantiana, Spain. But when he went to New Spain, he married an Indian woman named Maria de Zamora from the Barrio de San Sebastián in Mexico City. That was one of 4 indigenous neighborhoods in the area. This couple married in Mexico City around the mid-1590s. They had children that they brought with them and had in New Mexico as well that were designated as mestizos. The Griego family. Juan Griego was from Greece and was also a 1598 colonist who married Pascuala Bernal in Mexico City. They brought their children, identified as mestizos, to New Mexico. One son spoke Nahuatl, which gives us a hint as to the origins of their mom. Pascuala Bernal, she's probably Aztec or Mexica, and he was also fluent in the Tewa language of New Mexico, and was also an encomendero. So we see that these Casta people, mixed blood people of Spanish origin, but also native origin, are also the ruling class in New Mexico in the 1600s. The Anaya family, Francisco de Anaya Almazan from Mexico City. He was Spanish and a New Mexico colonist. He married Maria de Villafuerte. Maria was a highly acculturated Indian woman from the pueblo of Cuautitlan. This is where we get some of our Mexican Indian ancestry. A lot of these colonists were bringing wives that were Mexican Indian and therefore children that were half Spanish and half Mexican Indian. They married with local New Mexicans. The Tafoya family. These folks were also from Mexico City, the Valley of Mexico, and on 28 April 1697 at Santa Fe, Antonio de Tafoya Altamirano married Maria Luisa Godinez. She's a Mexico City colonist, and one of their sons, Felipe Tafoya, married Margarita Sayago González de la Rosa on 2 April 1728 in Santa Fe. What's important is this Sayago family that you see marrying into the Tafoya family. This is the Sayago Arroyo family. They came with the 1693 colonists from Mexico City that were supposed to be Spanish. Well, Margarita was the daughter of Diego Sayago Arroyo of Mexico City and Teresa Dominguez de Mendoza. That's an old New Mexico family that Teresa belonged to. Diego was the son of Diego de Arroyo and Maria de la Mora. They were the family that colonized New Mexico, and they were of Casta origin. Let's look at the Arroyo family as an example. Here's the marriage entry for Simón de Arroyo and Maria de Mora in 1684 at Mexico City. It doesn't tell us much, just that he was from there, but it tells us that he's a widower of Juana de Zuleta. And she's also from, Maria de Mora is also from Mexico City. It says that she's an orphan, but in the muster roll, she lists her father, Bartolomé de Mora, who is from a Casta family. So I went back and I found right here the first marriage record for Simón de Arroyo, his first marriage to Juana de Zuleta. And it says, Simón de Arroyo, mulatto, married Juana de Zuleta, mulata. They were free mulattos. So this supposedly Spanish family is obviously carrying African blood and colonizing and helping establish families in New Mexico in the late 1600s. And this is a transcription, partial transcription and translation of that document, and that tells us their origins. It says free mulatto and free mulata. The Vigil family of New Mexico. Francisco Montes Vigil was a New Mexico colonist of 1695 from Zacatecas, Mexico. He was the son of Juan Montes Vigil and an unknown mother because he was born out of wedlock. We know this because Juan Montes Vigil, in his 2 wills in Zacatecas, listed Francisco as an out-of-wedlock child. Francisco Montes Vigil, before coming to New Mexico, was married to Maria Jimenez Anciso. In New Mexico, this couple was considered Español, or Spanish. But we see in documents from Mexico, before they came to New Mexico, they had a child baptized on the 3rd of September in 1685 at Aguascalientes. Maria, she's listed as Morisca, legitimate daughter of Francisco Montes and Maria Jimenez. This means that, but we know from certain documents, Maria Jimenez was listed as Española or Spanish. So if their daughter's Morisca, that means Francisco was mulatto. On his dad's side, the Montes Vigil family, that traces back to Spain because his father's his grandfather was listed as being from Spain, but we don't know who his mom was. It was likely African woman, a servant, or some member of the community in Zacatecas. So look at this, a modern day casta system, DNA. These are my results. I've done my DNA with family tree DNA, and my Y chromosome comes back haplogroup JM172, the Middle East. That would be Spanish. And my mitochondrial DNA, my maternal chromosome, is B45. That's Native American New Mexico. So we have that. Let's look at the breakdown percentages of my DNA makeup. European, 50%, 31% Native American. That's a mix, again, of Mexican Indian, some Pueblo, but also those Genízaros. They're still with us, and they're in us, and they're part of us, an integral part of us, obviously. Middle Eastern, 8%. That would be roughly North African, Berber, Moorish, more than likely. And Jewish, 4%, Sephardic Jew. And then miscellaneous is 7%, African and European. So we're still doing this. We are still somewhat race obsessed, trying to figure out who we are, why we are, and where we came from. So for New Mexicans, roughly 80% of male Y DNA chromosome are Spanish. The other are either Native American or African. And then roughly 80% of female mitochondrial DNA for New Mexico Hispanic people is Native American. So this shows that the casta system was in full play for New Mexico starting in 1598. My mom's mitochondrial DNA is haplogroup B, Native American. So castas in New Mexico and in New Spain, these documents illustrate the complexities of the Spanish colonial casta or caste system, where individuals and families moved with fluidity from one designation to another. Castas in New Spain became españoles in New Mexico, though sometimes casta designations were carried to the north, such as mulatto, mestizo, castizo. I'd like to end with this quote by one of my favorite authors, Octavio Paz, a Mexican author. The strange food, the colors, the landscapes, the women with different skin and eyes, Indian, mestizo, mulatto, the complicity of the sun and the vegetation, the voluptuousness of the climate, all this stirred the imagination, the senses. And that's the end of my talk. Again, this is brought to you by the Office of the State Historian. I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. If you have any questions, feel free to call me at 505-476-7911. Email me at rob.martinez@state.nm.us. And please visit our website with all kinds of cool history information and photos and interesting stuff. We have a fantastic history here. So we'll see you next time. Hasta pronto.